Bank manager snubs farmer. Days later, bitterly regrets it. The day was clear and warm in Cedar Springs, a small town in rural Georgia. Thomas Miller sighed deeply before entering the imposing building of National Credit Bank. At 58 years old, with a lifetime dedicated to growing organic specialty coffee, he never imagined he would face the humiliation that was about to come. The bank manager, Richard Parker, was known for his impeccable suit and for treating with disdain those he considered too small to deserve his attention. When Thomas entered his air-conditioned office, Richard barely looked up from the papers. He pretended to read. "Yes?" he asked with evident impatience. "Good morning, sir." Thomas adjusted his hat in his calloused hands. "I came about that loan we discussed on the phone last week." Richard slid his eyes over the man before him. Simple clothes, hands marked by hard work, dusty shoes. A slight smile of contempt appeared at the corner of his lips. "Ah, yes. You're that owner of that little farm, aren't you? What's it called?" "Hope Farm, sir," replied Thomas, feeling the first blow of disdain. "It's been in the family for 3 generations." Right. The manager quickly flipped through a folder, without really paying attention. "Look, Mr. Miller, Thomas Miller. Mr. Miller, I'll be direct. The bank cannot grant this loan. Your property is, how can I put it, too small to guarantee the amount you're requesting." Thomas felt his stomach sink. He needed that money to modernize production and meet the demand of a major coffee shop chain that had shown interest in his special organic coffee. "But sir, I have all the documents here. Hope Farm has a consistent production history. We've never owed anything to anyone. And now with this contract from Atlanta Premium Coffee." Richard raised his hand, interrupting Thomas, as if shooing away an inconvenient fly. "Frankly, Mr. Miller, this type of contract is for producers with a different profile. Do you really believe your small family operation can supply a chain like that?" As he spoke, the manager glanced at his secretary, who smiled in complicity. Thomas felt his blood boil but maintained his composure. "With all due respect, sir, I'm not asking you to believe in me. I'm asking you to analyze the numbers and the proposal I brought." The manager didn't bother to look at the folder Thomas was trying to open. "We've analyzed enough. The bank has protocols, you understand. I can't simply grant loans to any farmer who shows up with a story about a big contract." The word farmer came out of his mouth as if it were an insult. At that moment, Thomas's cell phone rang. It was his daughter, Emily, a business school graduate who handled the commercial side of the farm. "Excuse me, sir. I need to take this." Richard made an impatient gesture as Thomas stepped into the hallway. Emily was euphoric on the other end of the line. "Dad, Atlanta Premium Coffee just confirmed they want exclusivity for our premium coffee. They're offering 30% above market value and an advance payment for expansion." Thomas felt a mixture of joy and apprehension. The news was wonderful, but now he was even more dependent on the loan to make the expansion viable. "That's great. Honey, but I'm here at the bank and things aren't going well." "What do you mean everything is documented? The numbers don't lie." "The manager doesn't even want to look at the papers properly. I think he..." At that moment, Richard's office door opened. The manager came out accompanied by another man in a suit, both laughing. When he saw Thomas on the phone, Richard paused briefly. "Mr. Miller, I have other commitments now. I suggest you look into some small producers cooperative. It might be more suitable for your level." And he continued down the hallway without waiting for a response. The other executive looked Thomas up and down and whispered something to Richard, who laughed. On the phone, Emily heard everything. "Dad, what was that? What did he say?" Thomas took a deep breath, feeling a mixture of humiliation and anger. "Nothing important, honey. Seems like we'll have to find another way." As he left the bank, Thomas passed through the reception and clearly heard when one of the clerks commented to another, "Look at the little farmer who thinks he can play businessman." The laughter followed him to the door. Thomas felt the weight of his 58 years more than ever. In his old pickup truck, he took a deep breath before starting the engine. He wouldn't tell Emily and Matt, his agronomist's son, the full extent of the humiliation he had suffered. He didn't want them to feel the same shame. What Thomas didn't know was that this day of humiliation would mark the beginning of a transformation that no one could have predicted. In just a few days, manager Richard Parker would bitterly regret the contempt with which he treated the simple farmer from Cedar Springs. Upon arriving home at Hope Farm, Thomas was greeted by the enthusiasm of Emily and Matt, who were already planning the expansion of production to fulfill the contract with Atlanta Premium Coffee. "Dad, this will transform everything," said Matt, his eyes shining. "With the irrigation system I designed and the new seedlings, we'll triple the production of premium coffee. And they've already emailed the contract," added Emily. "They're offering technical partnership too. It's an unbelievable deal." Thomas tried to smile, but the weight of the bank's rejection still hurt in his chest. "The problem is that we need the loan to make all this happen." "And what did the bank say?" asked Matt, already noticing from his father's expression that something hadn't gone well. "They said no," Thomas answered simply, sitting in the old chair on the porch. "The manager wouldn't even look at the project properly." Emily frowned. "What do you mean? With a contract of this size guaranteed, any bank should—" "Not for an old country bumpkin like me, apparently," interrupted Thomas, letting some bitterness escape. Matt and Emily exchanged glances, surprised by their father's tone, usually so positive. "What happened there, Dad?" insisted Emily, sitting beside him. Thomas hesitated, but ended up telling everything. The contempt in the manager's eyes, the snickers, the malicious comments. As he spoke, he saw indignation growing on his children's faces. "That arrogant stuffed shirt," exploded Matt. "Who does he think he is?" "We can look for another bank," suggested Emily, already grabbing her laptop. "With the Atlanta Premium Coffee contract in hand, someone will give us credit." "The problem is time," explained Thomas. "We need to start the expansion in 30 days to meet the schedule. A new loan process could take longer than that." "Then we'll have to be creative," concluded Emily, with a determined gleam in her eyes that Thomas knew well. It was the same look her mother, Sarah, had before she passed away 10 years ago after a long illness. "We have a plan B." That night, as Thomas tried to sleep, he couldn't imagine that the bank's rejection would be just the beginning of a journey that would change not only the destiny of Hope Farm, but also that of all Cedar Springs. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like the video and especially to subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. The next morning, Emily woke up, determined not to give up so easily. With her business degree from UJ and experience at a multinational before returning to help on the family farm, she knew there were alternatives beyond traditional banks. "Dad, I scheduled a video conference with the Atlanta Premium Coffee leadership for this afternoon," she announced during breakfast. "I'll explain our situation and see if they can advance a larger portion of the contract." Thomas shook his head, concerned. "I don't want to start this partnership seeming desperate or unprofessional." "It's not desperation, Dad," argued Emily. "It's strategic negotiation. They have as much interest in our coffee as we do in selling to them. If they increase the advance payment, we reduce the need for a loan." Matt, who was returning from the orchard with some fresh fruit, joined the conversation. "Plus, I have an idea to reduce the initial costs of expansion. I talked to Professor Wilson from college, and he's willing to bring final-year agricultural science students for an experimental project here. They would do part of the work as an internship, and we would save on labor costs." Thomas looked at his children with a mixture of pride and gratitude. Even after the humiliation of the previous day, they weren't giving up. On the contrary, they were finding creative solutions to the problem. "You really are Sarah's children," he commented with a nostalgic smile. "She always said that for every problem, there are at least 3 solutions." The video conference with Atlanta Premium Coffee positively surprised the Miller family. Carlos Davis, the chain's supply director, not only agreed to increase the advance to 40% of the contract value, but also offered technical support for the expansion. "Your coffee has unique characteristics that our most demanding customers love, Mr. Miller," explained Carlos on the computer screen, "and we love the story of Hope Farm with 3 generations dedicated to organic coffee. It's the kind of partnership we value." After the meeting, the mood on the farm was different. With the larger advance and partnerships with the university, they would need a much smaller loan which they could get from the local cooperative. "See, Dad, said Emily, hugging Thomas. "That arrogant manager did us a favor. If we had easily gotten the loan, we wouldn't have sought these better alternatives." Thomas smiled, but he still felt the bitter taste of humiliation. It wasn't just about the money or the denied loan. It was about how he had been treated, as if a lifetime of honest work meant nothing in front of an expensive suit and a mahogany desk. The following days were filled with intense work at Hope Farm. Matt coordinated the agricultural science students in measurements and preparations for the expansion, while Emily finalized the details of the contract with Atlanta Premium Coffee and the small loan operation with the cooperative. Thomas supervised everything, but he still hadn't fully recovered his usual enthusiasm. One afternoon, while walking among the coffee plants, admiring the fruits that were beginning to ripen, he was surprised by the arrival of an unfamiliar pickup truck. From it stepped a middle-aged man, well-dressed but with an unpretentious air. That contrasted with the arrogance of the bank manager. He introduced himself as Michael Andrews, an investor and entrepreneur in the specialty coffee business. "Sorry to show up without notice, Mr. Miller," he said, extending his hand to Thomas. "But when I heard about your partnership with Atlanta Premium Coffee and tasted your coffee, I couldn't wait. I'd like to see the farm and talk about possible business opportunities." Thomas found the unexpected visit strange, but something in Michael's frank and direct manner made him like the visitor. He took him to see the property, proudly showing the carefully tended coffee plants grown with organic methods, the small processing facility they planned to expand, and the sustainable techniques they had developed over the years. Michael asked pertinent questions and seemed genuinely interested. When they reached the farmhouse, Emily and Matt were already waiting for them, curious about the unexpected visitor. "Your family and your operation are impressive, Mr. Miller," said Michael as they drank coffee on the porch. "And now I understand why Atlanta Premium Coffee made such an effort to secure exclusivity for your premium coffee." "What do you mean?" asked Emily, intrigued. "You don't know. There's a small war in the market for organic coffees from traditional producers with sustainable practices. It's what the most demanding consumers want today. And from the samples I've tasted, you have something special here." Matt looked at his father with a smile. "We've always said that, haven't we, Dad?" Michael took another sip of coffee and got straight to the point. "The reason for my visit is that I'd like to invest in Hope Farm, not just as a financier but as a minority partner. I have experience in international marketing of specialty coffees and believe we can expand far beyond Atlanta Premium Coffee, including exports." The proposal caught the family by surprise. Thomas had never considered having a partner. The farm had always been a family business. "I appreciate the interest, Mr. Andrews, but—" "Dad," interrupted Emily, "I think we should at least hear the details of the proposal." Michael smiled, understanding. "I understand your hesitation, Mr. Miller. A family farm for 3 generations is not something you easily share. That's why I propose a limited partnership only for the premium coffee export line, keeping the main operation entirely under your control." The conversation extended into the afternoon. Michael explained how his experience and contacts in the international market could open doors that the Miller family had never imagined. He talked about values, percentages, and projections that made Emily's eyes shine with enthusiasm. When the visitor finally said goodbye, promising to send a formal proposal in the coming days, the Miller family had much to discuss. "What do you think?" asked Thomas, still cautious. "His proposal is much better than any bank loan, Dad," replied Emily. "We wouldn't have debts, just a partner who clearly knows the market and can add value. And he seems to respect our methods and traditions," added Matt. "He doesn't want to change our production methods, just expand our reach." Thomas pondered his children's words. Deep down, he was still marked by the humiliating experience at the bank and the idea of not having to submit again to figures like Richard Parker was tempting. "We'll analyze the proposal when it arrives and decide as a family, as we've always done," he concluded. What none of them knew was that Michael Andrews' visit wasn't as casual as it seemed, and that the events of the next few days would connect the destinies of Hope Farm and National Credit Bank in ways no one could predict. 3 days later, Michael Andrews' formal proposal arrived by email. It was even better than he had verbally suggested. immediate investment for expansion, participation of only 25% in export profits, and a special bonus, contacts with European buyers already interested in coffees with the history and quality of Hope Farm. While the Miller family was analyzing the proposal, in town, manager Richard Parker was facing his own problems. A surprise audit from the central bank had found irregularities in some loans approved by him, all to local businessmen with whom he maintained personal relationships. Nothing explicitly illegal, but questionable enough for the bank's headquarters to demand explanations. Sitting in his office with the door closed so no one would notice his nervousness, Richard reread the emails from the directors. He needed to show new solid business operations that could improve the branch's indicators. That's when he remembered Atlanta Premium Coffee, an account he had long tried to attract to the bank. A phone call to a contact at the company revealed the news. They had closed a significant contract with a local producer, Hope Farm. The name made Richard freeze. It was the property of that farmer he had despised days before. And they say they're expanding production. His contact continued, unaware of Richard's discomfort. Seems they secured private investment and university support. They're becoming a success story in the sector. After hanging up, Richard remained motionless, staring at the wall. He had made a judgment error that could cost his career dearly. If Hope Farm really took off with this contract, and under his nose after he had denied the bank's support, his competence would be questioned. He decided to act quickly. He picked up the phone and called Thomas Miller, trying to disguise the urgent tone in his voice. "Mr. Miller, this is Richard Parker from National Credit Bank. I'd like to reschedule our conversation about your credit application. Additional information has come up that may facilitate approval." On the other end of the line, Thomas felt a mixture of surprise and satisfaction, so the arrogant manager now wanted to reconsider his decision. He thought about refusing immediately, saying he no longer needed the bank. But something made him hesitate. "I appreciate the contact, Mr. Parker. However, our situation has changed in the last few days. We're considering other financing options." Richard felt his stomach sink. Thomas's polite but distant tone said a lot. "I understand, but the bank would be willing to offer special conditions for a client with your potential. Could we meet tomorrow to discuss?" Thomas thought about Michael Andrews' proposal, which they planned to accept, but he also thought it wouldn't hurt to hear what the bank had to say now. "All right, tomorrow at 10 a.m.? Perfect, I'll be waiting. And Mr. Miller?" Richard hesitated. "I apologize if there was any misunderstanding in our previous conversation." When he hung up, Thomas smiled slightly. It wasn't exactly a sincere apology, but it was a start. He told the news to Emily and Matt, who reacted with surprise. "What changed?" asked Matt, suspicious. "They probably found out about the contract with Atlanta Premium Coffee," answered Emily. "Suddenly they realized we're a valuable client." "Exactly," agreed Thomas. "And that's why I'm going to the meeting tomorrow, even though we've practically decided to accept Mr. Andrews' proposal." "Why?" questioned Matt. Thomas's eyes shone with renewed determination. "Because I want to look in the eye of that man who treated me like nothing and show him that I don't need him anymore." The next morning, Thomas carefully prepared for the meeting. He didn't wear a suit or tie. He remained faithful to his cotton shirt and well-pressed pants, but asked Emily to print all the documents from the Atlanta Premium Coffee Agreement and Michael Andrews' proposal, organized in an elegant folder. Upon arriving at the bank, he noticed an immediate change in treatment. The same receptionist who had laughed at him days before now smiled servilely. "Mr. Miller, Mr. Parker is waiting for you. Please, follow me." Richard received him standing, with a forced smile, and extending his hand with exaggerated enthusiasm. "Mr. Miller, good to see you again. Please sit down. Would you like coffee?" "No, thank you," replied Thomas calmly, sitting in the chair across from the manager's desk. "As you must be busy yourself, let's get straight to the point." Richard cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. Of course. Well, after a reanalysis of your case, the bank has concluded that your loan application is viable. In fact, we're willing to offer up to 30% more than the originally requested amount, with a reduced interest rate." Thomas kept his face impassive, although inwardly He felt a small satisfaction seeing the same man who had despised him now practically begging for his business. "And what changed since our last conversation, Mr. Parker? My farm is still the same little farm, as you called it." Richard swallowed hard, visibly uncomfortable. "It was a misunderstanding, Mr. Miller. Of course, we always value traditional producers like you, and now that we've learned about your contract with Atlanta Premium Coffee, it's clear that your operation has great growth potential." "I see." Thomas slowly opened his folder. "And exactly how did you find out about that contract?" The manager hesitated for a moment. "The market talks, Mr. Miller, and good news spreads." Thomas nodded, thoughtful. Then he placed the documents from the Atlanta Premium Coffee contract on the table, and beside them, Michael Andrews' investment proposal. "You know, Mr. Parker, it's curious how things change in a few days. When I came here, I really needed that loan. It was essential for our expansion, but you didn't even bother to look at my documents, remember?" Richard looked at the papers on the table, then at Thomas, feeling that the conversation wasn't going in the direction he had planned. "Says, as I said, I'm sorry if there was a misunderstanding." "It wasn't a misunderstanding," interrupted Thomas with a firm but controlled voice. "You made very clear what you thought of me. A hick, an insignificant little farmer. Your exact words, if I'm not mistaken, were that I should look for a small producers cooperative because it would be more suitable for my level." The manager turned pale. He hadn't expected Thomas to have memorized his words so precisely. "Mr. Miller, in the business world we are sometimes too direct. It wasn't my intention to offend you." Thomas smiled slightly without warmth. "As it happens, your rejection was the best thing that could have happened to Hope Farm. It forced us to seek better alternatives." And then calmly, he explained about the increased advance from Atlanta Premium Coffee, the partnership with the university, and finally, Michael Andrews' proposal. "So, as you can see, Mr. Parker, we no longer need your bank's loan." Richard's expression was a study in contained desperation. That account that could help him with the directors was slipping through his fingers. "Mr. Miller, perhaps we could make a counteroffer. The bank could offer even better conditions than this investor." Thomas stood up, collecting his documents. "I didn't come here to negotiate, Mr. Parker. I came to inform you that we no longer need your bank's services, and also to give you some advice. Never judge a book by its cover, or a farmer by his simple clothes." As he walked to the door, Thomas stopped and turned. "Oh, and one more thing. I'll be transferring all of Hope Farm's accounts to the Rural Cooperative Bank this week. They may not have as beautiful a building as this one, but they know how to recognize the value of honest work." Leaving a stunned Richard behind, Thomas left the bank with his head held high, feeling lighter than he had felt in days. The humiliation had been washed away, not with revenge, but with dignity and success. What he didn't know was that that conversation was just the beginning of the regret Richard Parker would feel. In the following days, the news that Hope Farm had refused the National Credit Bank loan in favor of a private investor circulated quickly in Cedar Springs. For a small town where everyone knew each other, it was a juicy topic of conversation, especially because many other small business owners and farmers in the region had already faced Richard Parker's contempt. At Hope Farm, the expansion works began at an accelerated pace. With Michael Andrews' investment, they were able to hire more employees, buy better equipment, and begin construction of a new coffee processing structure. The agriculture students, guided by Matt, implemented innovative irrigation systems and organic management that promised to increase productivity without compromising the special quality of the beans. Emily, meanwhile, immersed herself in creating a marketing strategy that highlighted the Miller family history and the unique aspects of Hope Farm coffee. With Michael's help, they established contacts with buyers from Germany, France, and Japan, all interested in organic coffee with origin certification. Thomas observed everything with a mixture of pride and astonishment. In just 2 weeks, his little farm, as Richard Parker had disdainfully called it, was transforming into a much larger business than he had ever dreamed. "You built a solid foundation over decades, Mr. Miller," commented Michael during a visit. "All that was missing was someone to recognize the potential and give the right push." Meanwhile, at National Credit Bank, Richard Parker faced consequences he hadn't foreseen. The regional directorate, upon learning that he had initially refused business with a producer who was now attracting foreign investment, demanded explanations. Worse yet, other clients of the branch, inspired by Thomas's example, began transferring their accounts to the Rural Cooperative Bank. In a month, the Cedar Springs branch recorded a significant drop in deposits and operations. Richard was called to the regional headquarters for a meeting that he already knew wouldn't be pleasant. "Your risk assessment is seriously compromised, Parker," said the regional director without mincing words. "First, the questionable loans. To your business friends now this. You've transformed a potential major client into a symbol of resistance against our bank." Richard tried to defend himself, minimizing the impact of the situation, but the numbers didn't lie. The loss of business was real and growing. "I'll give you one last chance to reverse this," concluded the director. "Bring Hope Farm back as a client. Show that you can recognize and correct your mistakes or start preparing your exit." Richard's situation was desperate. His career, built on appearances and connections more than actual competence, was at risk. He needed to find a way to convince Thomas Miller to reconsider, but how? The farmer's wounded pride would not be easily appeased with empty apologies. He decided to resort to more aggressive tactics. Through contacts, he discovered that Atlanta Premium Coffee was facing problems with its second-largest supplier. If he could create obstacles for Hope Farm to deliver its first shipment on time, he could force them to seek emergency assistance, which the bank would offer under special conditions. The plan was risky and bordered on questionable ethics, but Richard was desperate. He began circulating rumors about possible problems with Hope Farm's organic certification, discreetly contacted the regional environmental agency, suggesting a thorough inspection of the new facilities, and through a contact in the municipal government, tried to delay the issuance of some licenses necessary for the expansion. Some of these actions began to take effect. The surprise environmental inspection caused a week's delay in the works. Rumors about the certification made Atlanta Premium Coffee send their own technicians for verification, generating unnecessary tension, and the municipal licenses were taking longer than normal. Emily was the first to realize that something strange was happening. "Dad, these problems all appearing at the same time is no coincidence," she said during a family meeting. "Someone is trying to harm us." "But who would do that?" asked Thomas, genuinely surprised. He had always maintained good relationships with everyone in the region. "I have a theory," replied Emily, her eyes shining with indignation. "Richard Parker." Matt, who initially found the theory exaggerated, stopped to reflect. "It makes sense. Miguel's cousin, who works at City Hall, mentioned they received a special inquiry about our licenses. And guess from whom?" Thomas shook his head, incredulous. "That would be very low, even for someone like him." "I'm going to investigate further," promised Emily. "If he is indeed trying to sabotage our work, he'll regret it even more than he must already be regretting." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like the video and especially to subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. Emily didn't waste time. With her experience in large corporations, she knew how to conduct a discreet investigation. In the following days, she used her contacts in town and college friends who worked in the financial sector to gather information about Richard Parker and the situation of the National Credit Bank in Cedar Springs. What she discovered exceeded her initial suspicions. Not only was Richard actively trying to create obstacles for Hope Farm, but he was also facing an internal audit due to questionable operations with other clients. His position at the bank was hanging by a thread, and he seemed willing to do anything to save his career. "We need to be smart, Dad," said Emily, presenting her findings to the family. "He's desperate, and desperate people make mistakes." "What do you suggest we do?" asked Thomas, who still felt uncomfortable with the idea of entering into a direct war with the manager. "Let's document everything, every interference, every suspicious delay," she replied. "And meanwhile, let's accelerate our expansion even more. The best response is to show that not even sabotage will stop us." Matt, always more impulsive, wanted direct confrontation. We should expose this jerk, report him to the bank's management, to the local press. Not yet, pondered Emily. If we do that now, we'll seem like the aggressors, and he the victim. We need to let him dig his own grave a little more. Emily's strategy proved to be right. Instead of directly confronting the obstacles created by Richard, the Miller family and their expanded team found creative ways to work around them. When the environmental inspection delayed the works, they mobilized the college students for intensive work on weekends, making up for lost time. When municipal licenses were slow, Michael Andrews used his contacts at higher levels of the state government to speed up the process. And most importantly, they meticulously documented each suspicious interference, building a dossier on Richard Parker's actions. The manager, in turn, became increasingly frustrated to see that his sabotage attempts were not having the desired effect. Hope Farm was not only keeping to its expansion schedule, but seemed to be growing even faster than predicted. The Miller's specialty coffee, now with the Hope Premium brand, was beginning to appear in specialized media and attracting even international attention. In a desperate move, Richard tried his riskiest play. Using privileged banking information, he discovered that despite Michael Andrews' investment, Hope Farm still had a vulnerable point. An old loan Thomas's father had taken out with the National Agricultural Bank, which had later been absorbed by National Credit Bank. The loan, although small and with payments up to date, had a terms review clause that had never been activated, but which would allow the bank, under special circumstances, to renegotiate the conditions or even demand early repayment. Without consulting the regional directorate, Richard initiated the process to activate this clause, hoping to force the Millers into a difficult financial situation that would compel them to seek emergency support, which he magnanimously would offer, saving his reputation at the bank. What he didn't count on was the information network Emily had established. An employee in the bank's legal department, a college friend of hers, alerted her about the unusual movement involving the old loan. "Dad, did you know about this loan Grandpa took out 15 years ago?" she asked, showing him the documents she had obtained. Thomas frowned, surprised. "Of course I did. It was to build the first drying shed, but it's a small amount, and we've always paid on time." "Why?" "Because Richard Parker is trying to use an obscure clause in this contract to pressure us financially," explained Emily, indignant. "He really has no limits." It was the last straw for Thomas. One thing was trying to interfere with their current business, quite another to mess with his father's legacy, with the family's history. "Enough patience," he declared, with a determination that surprised even his children. "Let's put an end to this once and for all." The next morning, Thomas, accompanied by Emily and Matt, went to National Credit Bank. But instead of asking to speak with Richard Parker, he requested a meeting with Paul Fisher, the regional manager who was in town precisely to monitor the situation of the local branch. The secretary tried to dissuade them, saying Mr. Fisher was busy, but the firm presence of the Miller family and Thomas's polite but unwavering insistence eventually won out. They were led to the meeting room, where the regional manager received them with curiosity. "Mr. Miller, I didn't expect to see you here today," commented Paul, extending his hand. "What can I do for the family that has become the sensation of regional agribusiness?" Emily's expression showed surprise at the friendly tone, so different from the treatment they had received from Richard. "Mr. Fisher, I've come to address a serious matter involving your branch, and more specifically, Manager Richard Parker," replied Thomas calmly. The regional manager's smile diminished a little. "I see. Perhaps we should call Richard to this, our conversation?" "With all due respect, I prefer that he not be present initially," said Thomas. "After you hear what we have to say, you can decide if you want to involve him." Paul Fisher, an experienced man who had built his career based on integrity and good judgment, unlike Richard, nodded seriously. "Very well, I'm all ears." During the next hour, Thomas, with precise contributions from Emily and Matt, exposed the entire situation: the initial disrespectful treatment, the rejection of the loan without proper analysis, the sudden change in attitude when they learned about the contract with Atlanta Premium Coffee, and finally, the meticulously documented evidence of sabotage attempts culminating with the manipulation of the old loan. Paul Fisher listened to everything with increasing attention, his face passing from surprise to concern, and finally to contained indignation. "Mr. Miller, these are extremely serious accusations," he said when Thomas finished. "I must say that some of them coincide with concerns we already had internally about Mr. Parker's management." "We're not here to create problems, Mr. Fisher," intervened Emily. "We just want to work in peace without unfair interference, and of course for my grandfather's loan to remain on the original terms, as it always has been." The regional manager nodded thoughtfully. "I understand perfectly, and I thank you for bringing this directly to me instead of resorting to other means." What Paul Fisher didn't say, but everyone understood, was that this evidence could easily become a devastating public scandal for the bank, especially at a time when the institution was trying to improve its image with small and medium rural producers. "Regarding the old loan, rest assured, I'll personally review this issue today, and I guarantee that no obscure clause will be activated," he promised. "As for the rest, I need some time to properly verify all this information." "We understand," replied Thomas, standing up. "We're available for any additional clarification." As they were leaving, Paul Fisher asked one last question. "Mr. Miller, hypothetically, if the bank demonstrated that it truly values your work and offered genuinely advantageous conditions, would there be a chance of reconsidering your decision to transfer all accounts to the cooperative bank?" Thomas exchanged a quick look with his children before responding. "Mr. Fisher, I've always been a man of my word and principles, but I also believe in second chances, as long as they're sincere." Leaving the bank, the Miller family wasn't exactly sure what to expect. They had exposed the situation, presented their evidence, but the bank's concrete reaction was still unknown. "Do you think anything will come of it, Dad?" asked Matt as they walked to the car. "That Paul Fisher seemed like a serious man," replied Thomas. "Very different from Richard, but banks are banks. Let's continue our work and not count on any of this." Emily smiled, proud of her father. "Regardless of what happens, you showed more dignity and integrity than they'll ever have, Dad." What none of them imagined was that that morning's conversation would trigger a much faster and more forceful reaction than they expected. That same afternoon, Richard Parker was urgently called to Paul Fisher's office. Entering confidently, imagining it would be a routine meeting about the branch's goals, the manager was surprised to see, on the regional manager's desk, the folder with all the evidence presented by the Miller family. "Sit down, Richard," said Paul with unusual coldness. "We have a lot to discuss." The meeting lasted less than 30 minutes. Richard initially tried to deny, then minimized the accusations, and finally, when confronted with irrefutable evidence, tried to justify his actions as excessive zeal for the bank's interests. "Zeal for the bank's interests or for your career?" questioned Paul harshly. "You rejected a promising client based on prejudice, then tried to sabotage his business when you realized your mistake, and finally, tried to manipulate an old contract to financially pressure a family that has always honored its commitments. In what world does that protect the bank's interests?" Richard turned pale, realizing the gravity of the situation. "Paul, we've always been friends. You know how the pressure is in this position, the impossible goals they impose on us. We're not friends, Richard. We're colleagues. And your actions weren't just unethical, they were potentially illegal," Paul cut him off. "The board will be informed today, and you are suspended until the completion of the internal investigation." "Suspended? You can't do that. I have a family, commitments." "You should have thought about that before risking the bank's reputation." "Out of wounded pride," replied Paul, standing up to indicate the conversation was over. "Please hand over your badge and system password to Sylvia, and be thankful we're not taking this to the police yet." When Richard left the office, dejected and defeated, the branch employees observed with a mixture of surprise and, in some cases, poorly disguised satisfaction. The news of his suspension circulated quickly, first within the bank, then throughout the town. That night, while the Miller family was celebrating the success of the first test export of their premium coffee to Germany, the phone rang. It was Paul Fisher, asking to speak with Thomas. "Mr. Miller, I'd like to personally inform..." "I hope that all your complaints were confirmed in our preliminary investigation," he said without preamble. "Mr. Parker was suspended today, and I can tell you that his continued employment with the bank is highly unlikely." Thomas felt not exactly satisfaction, but a sense of justice being done. "I appreciate the transparency, Mr. Fisher." "There's one more thing," continued the regional manager. "I'd like to invite you along with your family to a meeting next week. The bank wants to discuss a genuine partnership with Hope Farm on terms that are truly advantageous for you." "We'll be happy to hear what you have to propose," replied Thomas, surprising Emily and Matt, who were watching him attentively. After hanging up, Thomas smiled at his children. "As I said before, I believe in second chances. Let's hear what they have to say." Richard Parker's suspension was just the beginning of his regret. In the days that followed, as the bank's internal investigation progressed, more irregularities in his management came to light. Other clients, encouraged by the Miller family's example, began to report similar situations of discriminatory treatment and decisions based on personal preferences rather than technical criteria. A week later, the Miller family attended the meeting with Paul Fisher and other representatives of the bank's board. They were received with genuine respect and attention, a radical change from the previous treatment. The proposal presented by the bank positively surprised everyone. Special conditions for financing the second phase of Hope Farm's expansion, preferential rates, and something even more significant, interest in establishing a specific credit line for small organic coffee producers in the region, inspired by the business model developed by the Millers. "We want to learn from the mistake we made with you," explained Paul, "and transform it into an opportunity to improve our relationship with rural producers who, like your family, combine tradition and innovation." Emily, always the most cautious in business, meticulously analyzed the proposal. "It seems genuinely advantageous, Dad," she commented after reviewing all the details. "And it could really help other producers in the region who don't have the luck to count on an investor like Mr. Andrews." Thomas, after careful consideration, decided to accept the bank's proposal. Not out of necessity, since the partnership with Michael Andrews was working perfectly, but because he saw an opportunity to create a positive impact that would go beyond his own farm. "National Credit Bank will be welcome as a partner of Hope Farm," he declared, shaking Paul Fisher's hand. "But I hope that the lessons learned from our story will transform into real changes in how you treat small producers." "You have my word, Mr. Miller," replied Paul, "and if I may be honest, your story is already causing changes within the bank that go far beyond Cedar Springs." Meanwhile, Richard Parker's life was taking a very different direction than he had ever imagined. After the conclusion of the internal investigation, he was officially dismissed from the bank. But the consequences didn't stop there. His reputation in town was irreparably tarnished. The same businessmen and producers who had once flattered him now avoided his company. He tried to find employment at other financial institutions, but the news of his unethical conduct preceded him. In less than 2 months, he found himself forced to sell his luxurious house and move to a modest apartment. His wife, who had always valued his status more than his character, asked for a separation. One Saturday afternoon, walking alone through the town center, Richard spotted Thomas Miller in front of the agricultural supply store. For a moment he thought about changing his path, but something impelled him to approach. Maybe it was desperation, maybe a rare flash of conscience. "Mr. Miller," he called with a hesitant voice. Thomas turned, surprised to see the former manager. The difference in his appearance was notable. The impeccable suit replaced by simple clothes, his face worn, shoulders bent by the weight of the consequences of his own actions. "Mr. Parker," replied Thomas, politely but without enthusiasm. Richard hesitated, the words difficult to come out. "I wanted to apologize for the way I treated you, for everything I did afterward. It was unforgivable." Thomas studied the man before him for a few moments. He saw a defeated man, not by circumstances but by his own choices. "You know, Mr. Parker, when my father taught me about coffee, he used to say that even an imperfect bean, if planted in the right soil and cared for with patience, can give rise to a strong plant." Thomas made a small pause. Forgiveness is important, but more important is learning from mistakes. Richard nodded, eyes lowered. I'm trying. It hasn't been easy. It never is, agreed Thomas. But if you really want to start over, the Producers Association needs someone with banking knowledge to help small farmers organize their finances. It's volunteer work, at least initially. Richard raised his eyes, surprised by the unexpected offer. Why would you do this for me? After everything? I'm not doing it for you, replied Thomas honestly. I'm doing it for the producers who can benefit from your knowledge. And perhaps in the process, you can recover something more valuable than a position or status, your own self-respect. In that brief conversation in the middle of the town square, something fundamental changed inside Richard Parker. He realized that his regret until then centered on the loss of his job and social position needed to transform into something deeper, a genuine desire for reparation. He accepted Thomas's offer. In the weeks that followed, he began working with small producers, many of whom he had despised in the past. The beginning was difficult. He faced distrust, biting comments, judgmental looks. But he persisted, applying his banking knowledge to really help those farmers organize their finances and obtain better credit conditions. Gradually, day by day, Richard Parker began his own journey of transformation, not by external pressure, but by a finally awakened understanding of the value of honest work and the dignity of each person, regardless of their social position or appearance. Meanwhile, Hope Farm flourished. The partnership with Michael Andrews opened international doors that Thomas had never imagined. The Miller family's specialty coffee began winning awards and recognition at specialized fairs in Europe and Asia. The credit line established by National Credit Bank, inspired by their story, helped dozens of other small producers modernize their operations. Emily definitively took over the commercial management of the business, implementing innovative marketing strategies that valued the family history and the farm's sustainable practices. Matt, in turn, transformed the property into a reference center for agroecological techniques, receiving visitors and students from all over the country. On a particularly busy harvest afternoon, while supervising the work of employees among the coffee plants laden with ripe fruit, Thomas found a moment of quietness to reflect. He thought about the humiliation he had felt in that bank office, the contempt in Richard Parker's eyes, and everything that had happened afterward. He realized that that painful moment had actually been a turning point not just for himself and his family, but for an entire community. The bank's rejection had forced them to seek paths they would never have considered. The manager's contempt had been transformed into fuel for even greater determination. And now, looking at his farm in full expansion, at his fulfilled children, at the satisfied employees, and even at Richard Parker, now working humbly to rebuild his life and help those he had once despised, Thomas felt a deep gratitude for the path traveled. Because in the end, true success wasn't just in the international contracts or the recognition of Hope Farm coffee. It was in preserved dignity, in values transmitted to his children, and in the certainty that respect for honest work, sooner or later, always prevails. On a Sunday morning, 2 years after the fateful encounter at the bank, the Miller family gathered for a special breakfast on the farmhouse porch, now renovated but maintaining its rustic charm. They were celebrating not only the record results of the last harvest, but also a new achievement. Hope Farm had been chosen as a model of sustainability by the country's largest association of coffee growers. Amid laughter and conversations, the phone rang. It was Paul Fisher, now Regional Director of National Credit Bank. Mr. Miller, I have news that I'd like to share personally with you and your family. Would it be possible for us to meet tomorrow? The next day at the bank branch in Cedar Springs, now managed by a manager chosen with input from the local community, Paul received the Miller family with evident enthusiasm. That credit line we created inspired by your story, he began. It was so successful that the National Board decided to implement it across the country. We're calling it the Hope Program, with your permission, of course. Thomas exchanged surprised looks with Emily and Matt. A national program for small producers. Exactly, confirmed Paul. And we want Hope Farm to be the official ambassador. Your story, Mr. Miller, has transformed not just your family's life, but is about to transform the reality of thousands of small producers across America. Emily, always practical, wanted to know the details. Matt immediately thought about the possibilities of further expanding the sustainable techniques they were developing. As for Thomas, he just smiled, thinking about how his father and grandfather would be proud to see that their small farm, once despised by an arrogant manager, now inspired a national program. As they left the bank, the family encountered Richard Parker. He had just concluded a financial guidance session with a group of small producers, work that surprisingly he had found to be more rewarding than his years as a manager. "Mr. Miller," he greeted with a sincere respect he had never shown before, "I heard about the HOPE program. No one deserves this recognition more than your family." "Thank you, Richard," replied Thomas, using the former manager's first name for the first time. "I think we've all learned something in these last few years, haven't we?" Richard nodded, a slight smile on his lips. "Me more than anyone. And you know what's ironic? I've never been so financially poor and never felt so rich in purpose." That phrase would stay in Thomas's memory for a long time. As he drove back to the farm, with Emily and Matt animatedly discussing plans for the HOPE program, he thought about how appearances deceive, both in people and in the opportunities life presents. The manager who had despised him, judging him by his simple clothes and calloused hands, now understood the true value of character and dignified work. The bank that had closed its doors to a small farmer was now creating a national program inspired by his story, and the humiliation that could have defeated him had ended up becoming the catalyst for a success that surpassed his most ambitious dreams. Arriving at Hope Farm, Thomas paused for a moment to admire the property. The old coffee plants planted by his grandfather now shared space with new varieties. The old shed had given way to modern processing facilities. Young agronomists walked among the plantations, learning and contributing to increasingly sustainable techniques. But the heart of the farm remained the same: respect for the land, commitment to quality, and the dignity of work that transforms small beans into something of inestimable value. That night, as he watched the sunset from the porch, Thomas thought about how sometimes we need to be despised to discover our true strength, and how even the bitterest of encounters can, with time and wisdom, transform into something sweet, just like coffee fruits, which start acidic and hard, but when properly cultivated and processed, reveal surprising notes of sweetness and complexity. The bank manager who had despised him had indeed bitterly regretted it, but in that regret he had found his own redemption. And Thomas, the simple farmer who had once been judged by his appearances, was now becoming an inspiration for an entire country. Because in the end, as he always told his children, no matter how small the seed, planted in fertile soil and cultivated with patience and integrity, it always reveals its true potential. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like the video and especially to subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. 6 months after the launch of the HOPE program, the Miller Farm received a special visit. A delegation of coffee producers from Colombia and Vietnam, two of the world's largest producers, came to see up close the sustainable techniques and business model that had inspired changes in the American banking sector. "It's incredible to think that it all started with a rejection," commented Emily, as she prepared the reception for the visitors. "Who would have thought that that terrible day at the bank would bring us here?" Thomas smiled, adjusting the same, simple hat he had worn for years, even now that he could afford dozens of expensive hats. "Your mother always said that closed doors aren't endings, they're detours that lead us to unexpected paths." The visit was a success. The foreign producers were impressed not only by the quality of the coffee and cultivation techniques, but mainly by the story of how a family of traditional producers had transformed rejection into opportunity. On the last day of the visit, while walking among the coffee plants, one of the Colombian producers asked Thomas, "If you could go back in time, Mr. Miller, would you change anything? Would you avoid that meeting with the manager who despised you?" Thomas paused for a moment, contemplating the red fruits that shone in the sun. "You know, I'm actually grateful for that meeting. That man's contempt made me see that I was limiting my own dreams, accepting the place others determined for me." He picked a ripe fruit and showed it in the palm of his hand. Like this bean, which could be just one more in an anonymous sack, but when recognized for its true potential, becomes something extraordinary. That night, during the farewell dinner for the international delegation, Matt announced news that surprised everyone. The university where he taught had approved the creation of a research center in sustainable agroecology, which would be built on land donated by Hope Farm. The Sarah Miller Research Center, he said in honor of his deceased mother. A space where young farmers from all over the country can learn and develop new techniques that respect the land and value traditions. The news was received with enthusiasm by everyone. Emily immediately began planning how the center could integrate with the farm's commercial operations, creating a virtuous circle of innovation and practical application. Among the guests was Paul Fisher, who had become a close friend of the family. At his side, discreet but visibly moved, was Richard Parker. The former manager, now coordinator of the financial education program for small producers, looked at Thomas with a mixture of admiration and gratitude. When the speeches began, everyone expected Thomas, as the family patriarch and central figure of the story they were celebrating, to be the first to speak. To everyone's surprise, he invited Richard to the center of the circle. "This story is not just about Hope Farm," said Thomas. "It's about how people can change, how we can all learn and grow even from the most difficult moments, and no one exemplifies that better than Richard Parker." A respectful silence fell over the group. Richard, visibly nervous, stepped forward. "When Mr. Miller entered my office that day, I judged him by appearances," he began, his voice choked. "I saw his calloused hands and simple clothes and thought I knew everything about him. What arrogance on my part." Richard paused, seeking the right words. "My contempt for this man and his family was the biggest professional mistake of my life, but the regret I felt afterward was also my greatest learning." He looked directly at Thomas. "I lost my position, my status, almost everything I thought was important, but I gained something much more valuable, an understanding of the true value of people, regardless of their position or appearance." Richard's words deeply touched those present. It wasn't just the story of a successful farm they were celebrating there, but a more complex narrative about redemption, second chances, and the human capacity for transformation. When the night ended and the guests said goodbye, Emily found her father sitting alone on the porch, contemplating the starry sky. "What are you thinking about, Dad?" she asked, sitting beside him. Thomas smiled, his eyes shining under the moonlight. "About how life comes full circle, honey. Remember when I came back from that bank humiliated, thinking we had reached the end of the line?" Emily nodded, remembering well that difficult day. "And now we're receiving international delegations, inspiring a national program, and even transforming the life of that man who despised us. You know what your mother would say?" asked Thomas with a nostalgic smile. "That the best harvests come after the strongest storms," replied Emily, repeating Sarah Miller's favorite saying. Both laughed, sharing that moment of connection between past and present, between lessons learned and fruits harvested. The next morning, as life on the farm returned to its normal rhythm after the excitement of the previous days, Thomas received an unexpected visit. It was Rachel, Richard Parker's daughter, a young woman in her early 20s whom he had only glimpsed during dinner. "Mr. Miller," she said after formal introductions, "I'd like to personally thank you for what you did for my father." Thomas looked confused. "I didn't do anything special, young lady." "I disagree," replied Rachel firmly. "You could have completely destroyed my father after what he did. You had all the reasons and evidence to do so, but instead of revenge, you offered a chance for redemption." She paused briefly, emotional. "The father I have today, humble, dedicated, genuinely concerned for others' welfare, is infinitely better than the arrogant and empty man he was before, and that wouldn't have happened without your generosity." Thomas felt touched by the young woman's sincere words. "You know, Rachel, I believe we all deserve the opportunity to become the best version of ourselves. Your father made mistakes, yes, but he had the courage to acknowledge them and the determination to change. The merit is his." Their conversation was interrupted by Matt's arrival, bringing exciting news. "Dad, I just spoke with the university people. The research center project was approved with maximum priority by the state government. Construction can begin next month. As Matt explained the details, Thomas noticed Emily approaching with an envelope in her hands and a surprised expression on her face. "This arrived for you, Dad," she said, handing him the official envelope. "It's from the Department of Agriculture." Thomas opened the envelope with curiosity, read the contents, and remained silent for a few moments, processing the information. "What is it, Dad?" asked Emily and Matt almost in unison. "They want me to be part of the National Advisory Committee for Family Farming Support Policies," he replied, still assimilating the invitation. "Me, a simple coffee producer from Cedar Springs." "Simple producer." Emily shook her head, smiling. "Dad, Hope Farm is now a national reference in sustainable production. You inspired a banking program that's transforming the lives of thousands of farmers, and your story of overcoming has become an example even internationally." Rachel, who was watching the scene, added, "Mr. Miller, if I may offer my opinion, you were never a simple producer. The problem is that people like my father once couldn't see that." Thomas looked at the young woman, then at his children, and finally at the letter in his hands. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps that timid farmer who had once nervously entered a bank, only to be despised and humiliated, really no longer existed. In his place was a man who had learned that his worth didn't depend on others' approval, a man who had transformed rejection into resilience, contempt into determination, and others' regret into an opportunity for growth for everyone. In the weeks that followed, news of the Department of Agriculture's invitation spread throughout the region. The small town of Cedar Springs swelled with pride at having one of its sons nationally recognized. The mayor organized a special ceremony to celebrate the honor, and practically the entire town attended. During the ceremony, Thomas was called to speak. He was never a man of many words, but on that day, before his community, he felt he needed to share the lessons he had learned on his journey. "A few years ago, in this same town, I entered a bank seeking support for a dream that seemed modest," he began. "I left there humiliated, judged not by my character or the quality of my work, but by my calloused hands and simple clothes." The crowd fell silent. Everyone knew the story, but they had never heard it directly from Thomas. "That day I could have given up. I could have accepted the place others determined for me. But something inside me, perhaps the same spirit that led my grandfather to plant the first coffee bush on this land, refused to accept that judgment." He paused, looking at Emily and Matt, who watched him with evident pride. "What we learned as a family is that we should not allow others' contempt to define who we are or what we can achieve. Each obstacle, each closed door, each discouraging word can be transformed into fuel for our determination." His eyes found Richard Parker in the audience. The former manager watched him with respect and a touch of emotion. "And we also learned about forgiveness and second chances, about how even those who hurt us can transform and grow, like a bitter coffee bean that, properly processed, reveals unexpected notes of sweetness." Thomas concluded his speech talking about the future, the research center that would soon be built, Hope Farm's expansion plans, and his new role on the National Committee. But what really touched the hearts of those present was his message about resilience, dignity, and the human capacity for transformation. At the end of the ceremony, while receiving congratulations from townspeople, Thomas spotted a familiar figure approaching, Paul Fisher, accompanied by two executives he didn't know. "Mr. Miller, allow me to introduce Dr. Robert Wilson, President of National Credit Bank," said Paul with evident satisfaction. The bank president, a middle-aged man with an air of seriousness, shook Thomas's hand firmly. "Mr. Miller, it's an honor to finally meet you in person. Your story has inspired significant changes in our institution." Thomas, surprised by the presence of such an important figure, responded with his usual simplicity. "The merit isn't mine, Dr. Wilson. It belongs to my family and all the people who believed in our work when others doubted." The president smiled. "That modesty is part of what makes your story so powerful." He gestured to the other executive accompanying them. "This is Alexander Cooper, our new Director of Social Responsibility. He came especially to discuss the expansion of the HOPE program and a possible partnership with the Research Center, your I, creating. As they discussed the details of this partnership, Thomas couldn't help but think about the irony of the situation. The same bank that had rejected him was now sending its president to meet him and propose cooperation. There was no bitterness in this realization, just the perception of how life can follow surprising paths. Later that day, back at Hope Farm, Thomas found a moment to be alone among the oldest coffee plants on the property, planted by his grandfather, almost 70 years before. He touched the gnarled trunks with reverence, feeling the connection between past, present, and future. "You would be proud, old man," he murmured, as if his grandfather could hear him. "Not just about the coffee, but about how we defended our family name." A gentle breeze moved the leaves of the coffee trees, as if in response. Thomas smiled, imagining what his grandfather would say about everything that had happened, the bank manager's contempt, the bitter regret that followed, and how that moment of humiliation had ended up becoming the catalyst for an extraordinary journey. He would probably say, with that simple wisdom of men of the land, that the best harvests come after the strongest storms, and that a coffee bean, just like a person, reveals its true value not when everything is easy, but when facing adversities. And indeed, the story of Hope Farm and the Miller family had become a living testament to that truth, a story that would continue to inspire others, reminding them that character and determination in the end always prevail over prejudice and contempt. Because in the world of coffee, as in life, true value is rarely apparent at first glance. It is revealed with time, patience, and proper treatment. And sometimes it takes someone despising us for us to discover what we're truly capable of. The end. Thank you for following this exciting journey. If Thomas's story touched your heart, please leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Tell us in the comments, have you ever faced prejudice that later transformed into success? Your opinion is valuable to us.